The man was going to die. Baan watched from the cliff top as he staggered backwards and fell, clutching his side. Sunlight struck his blonde hair, making it gleam in a brilliant, golden crown, shining in a way that was impossible to ignore. She had noticed the yelling and screaming first. Curiosity had gotten the best of her, and she had veered from the pack of wild stripha to fly toward the road, settling on the rocks of the twin cliffs to watch. From her vantage point she had a very good view of the scene unfolding below. Much better than if she had been in her human form. Crows had excellent eyesight, and as an entire flock of them she could watch the spectacle from many angles. The road was relatively new, though one would have never guessed it with the way it looked. Here the illustrious empire had built one of their cobbled roads through the sand, but the desert could only be delayed, not defeated. Sand often blew in and covered the stones, and the carved red cliffs that marked the start of Kavari territory loomed over it, a constant reminder of just whom this stretch of desert really belonged to. Baan watched the blonde man bleed. Gut wounds were a terrible way to die. If she had arrived even a minute or so sooner, she could have likely saved him from that fatal blow. If she had wanted to. Baan was not in the practice of saving outlanders. She watched from her perches, as he rolled in the dirt, leaving a trail of blood where he had been. His opponent, a dirty-looking man with likely a dirtier temper, swore viciously as he kicked at his head. Sensibly, the blonde man simply continued rolling until he was out of range, coming up into a painful-looking crouch with one knee tucked beneath him. He should have been in agony, but he was smiling, mouth bloody as he bared his teeth in a way that could not be described as friendly, though he looked maniacally cheerful. It was a truly bizarre expression. Was he insane? She glanced around the battlefield, taking it in. It seemed that the wounded man and his company had been ambushed by bandits. They were all dead now, their bodies strewn over the road haphazardly in bloody heaps. Baan could see that the attackers wore mismatched armor, which was a sure sign that the pieces had been stolen and assembled over time. This bandit was wearing padded cloth and leather bracers, which made him look particularly like a bandit. It looked hopelessly mismatched, and she couldn't imagine it was much better than going without. His opponent, however, was worse off. He was completely unarmored. He had been somewhat idiotic, running into battle in a tunic and chiton with only a sword in his hand. He was paying for it now. Wounded, he was no longer as agile, and he barely listed to the side in time to avoid the foot that would have laid him out. If he had been wearing a breastplate like his fallen companions, he would have not suffered a gut wound. The injury must have been agonizing. Even so, he never released his grip on his sword. The man was a warrior, and a good one at that. She could see it in the way the other attackers had fallen, their bodies lying clustered together as though he had killed them too swiftly for a sensible counter. She could only see a single lethal wound on each dead body. Efficient. Fucking die already. The bandit was not in a good mood, clearly. Baan did not know why he persisted, but the man was Dolkoiri. Dolkoiri loved violence, so perhaps there was nothing more to it than bloodlust. Baan had heard that bloody shows where men fought to the death against each other or animals was a popular pastime in Dolkoiri cities. They built buildings specifically to house such spectacles, which did not surprise her in the least. What were they called again? Colossums? Coliseums? Something like that. Well, since you're asking so nicely and all. He ducked as the bandit lashed out at his head. The man wheezed. Whatever clever rejoinder he'd had planned lost alongside the breath in his lungs, but the cheerful smile never left his face. What a madman. He was even grinning as he turned his head and spat. Baan could see it was bloody, even from her position on the cliff. Oh yes, it was a very serious injury. Even if he won here, he would not live to celebrate his victory for long. The bandit made a disgusted noise and tried to kick him in the head again. This turned out to be a mistake. The other man simply grabbed the bandit's foot and yanked, slamming his blade right into his thigh and groin. The bandit screamed as blood sprayed in an arc. He collapsed, making truly heinous animal noises of pain. Well, he was a dead man. There was no surviving a wound like that. The blond man cut his throat, silencing his cries. Quiet settled over the road, broken only by the wind and the ragged breathing of the last man standing. NNGH. Fuck. Baan watched as the victor pressed his right hand against his side, left hand still clutching his sword. He staggered, nearly falling before he caught himself using his blade as a crutch. He turned his head this way and that, still alert, looking for enemies. Tension slowly bled from his shoulders as he found only the dead and dying. He did another pass, slower this time, and she realized he was looking for someone. Baan was not concerned about being spotted. He would only see a flock of crows, and there was nothing suspicious about crows on a battlefield. The man ignored his fallen opponent and limped to a body that had clearly been thrown by a horse. The horse was nowhere to be seen, and the man was most certainly dead. There was an arrow sticking out of his neck, a precise strike that had taken him right in the gap between his helm and breastplate. He was dressed in the same manner as everyone else in the convoy. A neat tunic with blocky patterns on the hems beneath a bronze breastplate, thighs bare aside from the leather skirt, and in the same sort of colors. There was no mistaking the dolcoiri workmanship in the armor, either. The breastplate still gleamed bronze beneath all the blood, and she could still see they were stylized to resemble a man's bare torso. It left no room for guesswork as to its origins. They had been armed and armored, but that hadn't saved them. The covered traveling chariot was tipped over on its side, one of the wheels still spinning lazily as it teetered ever closer to falling off its axle. The surviving horses had long since bolted except for one unlucky roan lying on its side, its legs broken as it struggled and whinnied weakly. They had been some kind of escort. She could tell by the weapons and armor that they were what Outlanders called hippias, armored, mounted soldiers, very much like cavalry raiders, but with more bits of metal attached. They rode horses instead of desert strifa. The covered chariot looked expensive. It was pitch black, except for the wheels and axles, and decorated with what appeared to be precious metals, hammered thin and used as inlay. There was a crest that was made of gold on the door. It was the sun, depicted with bold, stylized rays protruding from a gleaming disc. Vaughn had heard of things like this before, but she had never seen it in person. It looked very impressive, though Vaughn was not sure if she would find it so if she had been using her human eyes, rather than the eyes of a crow. The inlay seemed to have its own inner glow. The man had arrived at the body. Laboriously, he raised a hand to shake him. "Recos," he said, and she knew the moment he realized his friend was dead because he closed his eyes in what could only be grief. She watched him turn his head to survey the field. Dead, 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 the lot of them. Soon, he would join them as well. He was the only unarmored man she could see. She wondered if he had been inside the carriage. Well, even so, she doubted he had been the only one. There had been someone else in there. Judging by the decor, Vaughn knew it had been a woman. She was long gone now. A kidnapping? The man levered himself back up to his feet with his sword, his face twisting into a grimace of pain. Fuck. Grunting, he made his way haltingly to the fallen horse, which was still thrashing. He looked down, and though she couldn't see his expression from where she was, she knew it must have been something like pity. Painfully, he sat himself down on the ground, leaning against the horse. "I'm sorry, old girl." Shush. "It's okay." The horse stared up at him, and Vaughn thought they must have been good friends. "Shush. I know, it hurts. Just." He dropped his sword and pulled out a knife. She saw the metal flash in the sunlight. The horse didn't make a sound. Eventually, the twitching stopped. The man settled himself against the dead animal and closed his eyes. His hair was matted with blood, but even so the clean bits gleamed in the light. His skin was pleasantly tanned beneath the blood and dirt. Everything about him was warm and golden. He was young. It was a pity he would die at his age, but she had seen younger men than him go. It was no business of hers if the dolcoiri killed each other. If anything, it was deeply convenient. She hopped up onto lean, twiggy shrub clinging to the top of the overhang, readying herself for flight. Her other bodies did the same. Outlander problems were Outlander problems. They had nothing to do with her, or with the people. It would be best if she simply flew on to her destination. It had nothing to do with her. At all. The man's eyes were closed, head tilted back as though enjoying the sun. He was still bleeding sluggishly, his hands and clothes a bloody mess. Perhaps he had lost consciousness. Vaughn watched him for another moment, noting the subtle rise and fall of his chest. He looked relaxed, as though he were only resting beneath the sun, not bleeding from his gut. To an onlooker it would have been a fantastical sight. A flurry of crows flew down to the ground and coalesced into a woman, dark-haired and barefoot and wearing only a coat of black feathers. She looked down at the young man, who was even now dying. Vaughn looked around at the carnage. This road ran right through the sand and past the two great cliffs which marked the start of cavalry territory, an open gate into the desert. Carved into the eastern cliff was the figure of Sanuvan, the witch that had led the people into the sand and freedom. Opposite to her stood Kuvaran, the chief who had joined the 12 tribes so they could be led. Between them was the open desert, and beyond the sandy dunes lay the Savuti Ver of the people, scattered now, and hidden. She knew the closest tribe was 6 days out by Strifa, 4 if one traveled the hidden paths through the Birvuti beneath the sand. It was close, though perhaps not so close that the Kavari would be blamed. Of course, the dolcoiri never needed a reason to blame Kavari for anything. She looked down at him again. Young, healthy, from what she could see, except for the wound that was killing him. He was handsome in a way that suggested a life of wealth and plenty. She did not think he had ever starved. Someone important. Her shadow fell across him, and he frowned. Blearily, he opened his eyes. They were amber and bright. Even as he lay dying in the dirt, she could feel his soul, blazing inside of him like a fire refusing to die even as his body began to fail. He met her gaze, eyes widening in what she guessed was surprise, or shock. But he never looked away, staring up at her as though transfixed. Baan made her decision. She raised her hand and covered his eyes. In another moment, a murder of crows cawed as they took wing. The man and woman were gone from the road, leaving only the dead staring up into the sky. The wound was not as bad as she had thought. He had been lucky. If his intestines or stomach had been punctured, she would not have been able to save him. The blade had gone into his side, tearing open skin, fat, and muscle, but just barely nicking his organs. His bloody spit had likely been courtesy of a blow to his jaw. A cut in the mouth. As far as she could tell, it had stopped bleeding already. What kind of luck was that? It had been difficult to sew him up alone. Usually Vati or Saluka would have helped, blotting the blood away so she could see and helpfully handing her whatever tool she needed when she needed it. But Vati and Saluka were not here. They were home. Only Baan was here, because only Baan had been banished. It would scar. Not only that, it would pull. She had not been able to stitch it as tightly and neatly as she could with assistance. Magic could be used to coax the flesh to mend, but everything had to be positioned manually, and this was difficult to do alone. Baan did not like doing subpar work, but it could not be helped. Even if she were not in exile, she would not have been able to take an outlander man into the Savutiver as she pleased. They would have told her to let him die. The life of an outlander, especially one who had been wounded outside of their domain, was no problem of theirs. It was no problem of hers, either. But there had been something in him that had called to her. She had felt it even from a distance, a sort of heat as he lay dying like the last lingering traces of a bonfire. The Kavari called it Ray Tat. For good or ill, this man had an air of destiny about him. Baan had been trained to recognize such things, and she was not likely to be mistaken. It was warm. His soul, it was warm, and bright. Even as she retreated to the kitchen, she could feel its heat and hear it humming, sunny and clear. It was making her peckish. She had expended a great deal of effort today, transforming not only herself but a passenger as well. She was tired, and a little hollowed out. She would need to go hunting soon, to placate the growing hunger inside her. Everything had a price, after all, and magic was especially expensive. Baan frowned into her mortar, pulling her attention away from the clamoring hunger building inside her. No, now was not the time. Infection control was the most important thing now. She had done everything she could to keep the wound clean, but he needed to drink Puloi tea to flush out any sickness that may have made its way into his blood. Baan had never made Puloi tea without the proper tools before. Most of her things had been left in the Shivu tea for her successors. The distillation had to be made inside the hollowed-out rocks carved specifically for that purpose, else the temperature would be too hard to control. There was no way to make Puloi tea properly in her cave. She could make Puloi tea saham, though. It was a precursor to true Puloi tea, and though not as potent, it would have to do. What a bother. The man was still sleeping. He hadn't stirred, not even when she'd stitched him up. His breathing was even, however, and steady. He wasn't feverish either, which was a good sign. It took most of the day and evening to make the Puloi tea saham. In the end she had made it a thick paste, which was the best she could do. She slathered it onto his wound, then saved some for later, wrapping it in a scrap of cloth. She would have to store it somewhere dark and a little damp, but not too damp. He would have to chew some too. Of course, he would have to be awake to do it. A bother. That's what this was. A bother. Baan stifled a sigh and looked at her guest. A bother. Baan woke up, disoriented as a sudden sense of unease crawled its way from her belly to her chest. Her eyes snapped open in the dark as she listened intently. She could hear the wind blowing, whistling against the mouth of her Notvuti, but that hadn't been what had woken her. Other than the wind, everything was quiet. Her coat seemed to be sleeping too, lying still and silent in her clothes chest. Nothing stirred. Starlight filtered through the hole in the ceiling, bathing everything in silver. Nothing was amiss. Nothing was. No, she was being watched. Baan rolled over onto her other side and met his stare. The man was awake, lying in her bed with his head turned so he could look at her. It was impossible to see his expression in the dark, but she could see his eyes, reflecting what little light there was in the room. She sat up from her little nest of rugs and blankets on the floor. They stared at each other in the dark. It was obvious that he could not speak Kavari. Dolkoiri rarely did, and even then, they spoke it badly. Baan could speak some Dolkoiri, though. It was a trade tongue, a prerequisite to anyone who wanted to do business with a vast empire that stretched from sea to sea. It wasn't a matter of liking it, really. You thirsty? The words rolled strangely in her mouth. Baan did not trade with outlanders much, though she did it when she had to. She listened a great deal though. Most people did not pay much mind to birds, so she had had ample opportunity to simply flutter about and listen. Even so, it was clear she should have practiced. Her mouth and tongue refused to move the right way to make the sounds, and her accent sounded thick, even to her own ears. He sat staring at her silently and she wondered if he had even understood her. Sometimes, when she traded, the merchants did not understand her. Sometimes, she had stolen what she had needed, because they did not have any patience for her at all. Yes, please. Water. Baan blinked. He spoke Kavari, not well, but he spoke it. Odd, but also oddly welcome. His voice was hoarse. She thought he must have been terribly parched, so she got him his water before adding wood to the fire. It had burned down to embers overnight, not nearly enough light for him to see by. Baan, of course, knew her own home by heart. She rarely bothered with light these days, and the hole where the ceiling should have been allowed enough starlight so the room always held a dim, silvery glow. It was a poor Gertagi, but it served well enough. Slowly, do not drink too fast. He seemed to understand Kavari well enough. He obeyed, watching her over the rim of his cup as he sipped. Baan slept with her hair loose. It was long, and she had no patience for the strands getting here and there when she was up and about. She was going to check his wound now that he was awake, so she needed it out of the way. She'd pinned her hair up a countless number of times, but she felt herself hesitate. He was still looking at her. The only man who had ever watched her put herself together was Thuran, and she could not shake how intrusive it felt to have a man she did not know watching her in the dark. Briefly, she touched the necklace of cliff cat teeth hanging around her neck, frowning. Her not-vuti was only one large room, so his presence could not be helped. It was her own fault he was here, but it was what it was. She did not know how he noticed. It was still dark, but he somehow seemed to sense her discomfort. Though she had said nothing, she had not even moved much. The man tilted his face downward and stared into his cup. Apology, he said in his stumbling Kavari. It rude. He frowned into his cup and tried again. That rude. That was rude. Baan pinned her hair up, refusing to be hurried. He was looking around, frowning lightly when he spoke next. Was there others? Of course. Baan shook her head. His head drooped, though he did not look surprised. He must have been expecting it. Do you need the privy? If he wished to speak Kavari, she would indulge him. There was a slight pause before he nodded. If Baan had her guess, it was probably urgent. He'd been sleeping for 2 days. Baan helped him to his feet. He was unsteady, but he could stand, and most importantly, walk. He looked around her cave, seemingly dazed. It was likely his first time inside a Kavari dwelling. Baan felt a little embarrassed. Her home wasn't a proper vuti. This had been a temporary site that had long been abandoned by her former clansmen. It hadn't been carved or set with waterways like a real vuti, and the walls were rough. They hadn't been decorated or carved, so she had hung animal skins and rugs to cover their bareness. The floor, too, was uneven. More rugs, even though it was laborious work to keep them clean. At least she had a fire pit, though it wasn't properly set into the floor, and the Gertagi served well enough, letting in plenty of sunlight in the day and starlight in the night. Thankfully, there was a privy built outside. All vuti were carved into cliffs or mountains. The Kavari were rock shapers. The dwellings extended inside the rock like an ant colony, with rooms dedicated to families or shops or even bathhouses, if an aquifer with water was available near the site. This site had been chosen well, and Baan suspected the only reason why this had not boomed into a full Savuti-ver was due to its relative isolation. It was an annoyance to go anywhere. It was an ideal location from which to explore unknown areas, but traveling to and fro every day would have been taxing for those who could not grow wings. Sheer cliffs on all sides, with the surface dry as dust and nary a tree or shrub to break the dull monotony of desert reds. Before her arrival this had been used as a watering hole, a Nurvuti. No Kavari dared to encroach now, of course. There were some incomplete underground passages. Baan had thought it had been meant to connect to other Birvuti eventually, but it had never been finished. Why that was would remain a mystery. No shaper remained inside the rock to tell her, and spirits simply avoided her. Whatever beings the rock had housed before her coming had long fled before her shadow had even darkened the doorway. They stepped out of the not-vuti, and the man's eyes widened at the sight of the cliff walls surrounding them. He likely had not realized that they had been inside one until just now. The not-vuti had been carved right into the rock. So had the privy, which required them to cross the little courtyard of dust and sand to the next cliff face. The shaper who had created the outhouse had dug in deep, well into the cliffside with the hole extending into a seemingly endless darkness. He said, when they approached the obvious seat with a hole in it. I can, alone. Really? She stared at him blankly. Really? Please, wait, out? She continued staring at him. Well, she decided to have some mercy, after all. No, she said in dull query, and he blinked in what she guessed was surprise. You will fall. You will rip stitches. Then I be very angry. He stared at her. She stared back. Baan made a noise of exasperation. You stupid? My apologies, he said finally in dull query. He glanced between her and the privy. I think I can manage by myself. Baan rolled her eyes and sighed. Loudly, she hustled him over to the hole in the rock that served as a toilet and held his arm. I will close eyes. Do not worry, I not want look at you, she said blandly, and he looked as though he couldn't decide how to react. I had many patients. You not different. It was awkward. He was clearly humiliated by the experience, though he said not a word, and Baan had no patience for delicate dolquery sensibilities. In the end, they made it back to the sleeping section of the Not Vuti in one piece. He seemed interested in the layout. There really wasn't much to see. There was only the entrance with a small space for storage, and then the hearth. The living area was built around the fireplace in a circle, with the sleeping area carved out across from the cooking area. Anything bloody had to be prepared over the stone slab outside, which was always a hassle as she had to haul water from underground to clean anything. Right in between the kitchen and the bed was a tunnel that arched downward into darkness. That was the way to the underground stream, which was where she got her water. She also bathed in one of the little pools that formed on the side, so she was always careful to draw water from upstream. He would not be able to take the downward slope, yet. If he managed to walk without hurting himself in the next week or so, she would take him on a tour. The underground cavern would be a shock to a typical dolquery man, but based on his obvious curiosity she thought he would enjoy it. He was very quiet, but he was looking at everything with great interest. Sometimes he raised his hand as though he wanted to touch this or that, but immediately stopped himself as though he was being incredibly rude. Knowing how obsessive dolquery were about property, she imagined it must be ill-mannered for them to simply touch things inside another person's home. Even so, she couldn't help but be amused at the level of enthusiasm he was showing toward her counters. Surely they were not that fascinating. Duck, she said, and he obeyed immediately. The ceiling was low near entrances, even though it opened all the way up in the central living room. He glanced up and gave a low whistle. It's open. He was staring right out of the rock and into the night sky, which was full of stars. Yes. Baan pointed to the wall. Steps had been carved along the sides, leading to loft after loft. He looked taken aback. He likely hadn't noticed the extra platforms in the near darkness. You can climb to roof. When storm, you close. Usually with a tarp. The sand still got everywhere, though. She pointed to the first platform up. It held the herbal things she couldn't fit inside her kitchen. Lots space. Well, it was all mostly storage. That's beautiful. His voice was quiet, but he sounded sincere as he stared up into the night sky. He hobbled to the stairway with her help and passed his palm across one of the steps. They were cut nearly perfectly, and smooth. A real Vuti would have had carvings running along the stairs, with grips set into the rock to prevent slippage. No climbing, she said, and he shocked her by laughing. Stop. Baan was appalled. Laughing would tear his stitches. She had had to do 2 sets. 1 set for his insides, 1 set for his outsides. It had been onerous work, especially alone. Ah, yes, I see, he grimaced. I'll try not to be stupid. He flashed her a smile full of white teeth. The awkwardness of the privy trip seemed to have melted away. Sit. She helped him back to the bed. The frame had also been carved out of stone, though she had added soft plants and furs to make the bedding. Even so, it wasn't the most comfortable. I want check, she said, and gestured to the bandages on his abdomen. He nodded. Baan brought over more bandages, boiled water, and her paloiti saham. You feel hot or cold? He shook his head. No, I feel fine. He looked up at her. You saved my life. Thank you. Baan shrugged, though she felt pleased by how quickly he had thanked her. It would have been annoying if he had acted as though it were his due. Kavari owed Outlanders nothing. She washed her hands in her basin and unrolled the bandages to look at his wound. It was still red and slightly swollen, but it didn't look as though infection had set in. That was good. She intended to keep it that way. She applied more paloiti saham to the wound. He didn't grimace or complain, only looked on curiously as she worked. He attempted to assist her until she snapped at him to keep his dirty hands away from everything. Impressively, he obeyed immediately, with only the barest knitting of his brows. You not wash hands. They dirty. Touch bandage. Bandage dirty. Touch wound. Wound dirty. Wound dirty? Blood fever. Blood fever? You die. Understand? He looked at her and nodded slowly. Yes, I think I do. So, I should not touch anything that will touch the injury unless I have washed my hands? With that? Baan nodded. Yes. Now shush. Once she was done, she wrapped him back up and washed her hands again. She needed to give him the Paloiti Saham, but he would need a meal first. It would make him vomit if he had had no food. Hungry? Yes. Baan nodded. She stoked the fire so that it was roaring again and set the cauldron over it. She brought him more water, though this time she stirred in some powdered sari lahi mixed with a distillate of nautha. It would help with the pain and discomfort. Lie down. I wake you when finish. He hesitated. I can lie down. Baan had never met anyone who could argue with her when she used that particular tone, and the outlander was no exception. His mouth clicked shut as he obeyed. Baan watched him for a moment longer to ensure he would not do anything stupid as soon as her back was turned before going to the kitchen. Baan began to make some soup. She did not think he could handle anything truly hearty, so she would have to make a simple meaty broth. The only meat she had was lizard. As far as she knew, Dolkoiri did not eat lizards. In fact, they thought it was particularly barbaric, something desert-dwelling savages did as they scraped through the sands for a living, as though they had not been the ones to push them there in the first place. Well, he'd have to have lizard for dinner. Lucky for him, she had some salt rocks still. Presumably, salt would make anything and everything taste good, though she doubted he would dare complain even if she fed him sandal leather. She could feel eyes on her back again. Yes? Baan turned to look at him. Thirsty? He was lying down, head turned so he could watch her from across the room. No, I'm fine. I would rather be useful. Baan clicked her tongue. You are bad patient. He stared at her. Resting important. You lift. You rip. I will be very angry. Perhaps it had been a mistake to give him painkiller in his water. He seemed to believe he was well when he was not. She enunciated her words carefully, trying to impress on him the importance of not ripping himself open again. She had seen the scars all over his back, with a particularly impressive collection clustered neatly in strips between his shoulder blades. There had been a large burn mark over one shoulder as well, which must have been nasty. His kneecap had fractured at one point, leaving behind a starburst and a limp. She had a feeling that he was a very poor patient, the type that did all sorts of things they were told not to do, like getting into fights. I'll stay here then. She bustled around, chopping up the meat into fine, unrecognizable pieces. She had some grains from her last trip to a Dolkoiri city, as well as many different mushrooms from the caves below. She would have to see if she could catch some fish tomorrow. He would need the meat. It turned out that he'd been ravenous. That was to be expected. He had slept for 2 days. Even so, he had followed her instructions to eat slowly, even forcing himself to stop when she told him to. It was strange. She had expected him to be more self-important, being young, rich, and Dolkoiri, but he had been shockingly agreeable. He hadn't even questioned the Paloiti Saham. He was chewing on it now, still looking at her. He seemed to do it reflexively whenever she entered his field of vision, which she supposed must be a natural reaction to being bored. He was bedridden after all, and she was the only moving thing in the vicinity. He is an overgrown cat. This impression was not helped by his leonine looks. Thick golden hair, a tanned complexion, and fierce-looking amber eyes. He had a very symmetrical face, with a strong jawline and high cheekbones. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, with a build that spoke of battlefield prowess. He smiled easily with seeming sincerity, so the corners of his eyes wrinkled. She noted he had very charming dimples. Undoubtedly, he was very popular with everyone, if only for his good looks. Baan didn't find his odd habit unnerving, but it was distracting. She could always feel it when someone was watching her, and her senses kept alerting her whenever his eyes fixed on her. Briefly she wondered if she ought to be worried, but why should she be? He couldn't hobble his way to the privy alone, and it wasn't as though she had anything for him to take, not with his obviously expensive things. Aside from his clothes and weapons, which were of very high quality, he had been wearing a ring with the same insignia that had been on the carriage. Some kind of signet, if she had her guess. He'd also had a little pouch full of small coins and a finger-sized wooden carving of a man with wings on his heels. Baan guessed it was one of the Dolkoiri gods, though she did not know which one. There was no reason for him to be malicious. Of course, it was possible he had seen her wearing the coat of feathers. Baan doubted that he remembered that, though, he had been busy bleeding to death. Finished? Obediently, he handed the cloth that had once been filled with Paloiti Saham back to her and she dutifully trundled back down to the caves to clean the thing. It was incredibly inconvenient to not have running water inside her Notvuti, despite a source of water running right beneath it. Baan, for all her magic, was not a stone shaper, and in truth, she had no desire to be, so there was no helping it at all. She would have to haul buckets of water for the rest of her miserable exiled existence. The horror. Once she got back, she banked the fire. Time to sleep, she told him, and he obeyed, letting her help him lie back down without a word of protest. Or at least, that's what she thought. Bon was settling into her nest on the floor when she heard him shift. Would you like to switch places? It was too dark to see his face now, but she looked in his general direction all the same. What? Why? There was a pause. I think I took your bed. Yes? It seems unfair. You saved my life and fed me, and now I'm taking your bed. It's a bit. She saw a movement in the dark. Some kind of gesture with his hands. That is stupid. He fell silent again. You are patient. Floor is cold and hard. Very stupid. See, if you hadn't told me that the floor was cold and hard, I wouldn't feel even worse about it. She made a noise of exasperation. Stop talking. Stop thinking. Sleep. I am tired. I want sleep. Understand? There was a pause. Yes. I'm sorry. Good night. Sleep well. Do not die. He snorted in amusement, low and quiet. Thank you. There was a long pause. My name is Lucios. I am Bon. Lucios? Yes? Stop talking. Sleep well. Bon. He sounded like he was smiling. Bon rolled herself inside her blanket and slept.